Don Price had a 31-year career in Orlando's records department. For 15 of those years, he was the sexton of Greenwood Cemetery. So he knows a lot of the history of Orlando. In 2004, most of you probably remember, we had hurricanes. They did a lot of damage to the cemetery, and Mr. Price enlisted volunteers to come and help clean up the cemetery. As people would walk through the cemetery, they would say things like, Bumby, is that the Bumby that Bumby is named after? Or Livingston, is that the Livingston? And he promised at the end of it that if they would get everything all cleaned up, he would take a tour. He did. It was popular. I have no idea how many tours you eventually took, Don, but a lot of them. They got extremely popular. It was hard to even get in. And now I think they're not doing them. So anyway, Don Price. Uh-oh.
Unmute. Where is he?
On your, yeah.
Oh, wow. Everybody got muted there, even me. Yeah, they had to stop because of COVID. With we were getting crowds of 50 to 60 people a tour, and it was very intimate. It was a close group, so the city had to stop them. They're gonna, hopefully we'll start again first of the year, but with the numbers going back up and everything going back up, there's no telling. There's no telling what the city's going to do. It's a big difference between opening up your city that you can come into a bar or go into, but when the city invites you into an area, it becomes a little different on that. So we've had to slow them down for a little bit, but we're still trying at all. So how many people have been on the tour? I know y'all are all muted, but by hand. All right. No, I haven't been on the tour. Well, I can, we can always make it up. So what I did is I have some photos and we have different things, but feel free to stop me and ask any questions that you have, because this is a new format for me and a lot of people, is this Zoom. I came up before they even had the computers in City Hall, so much less Zoom. So I have some photos, and a lot of these I don't usually take out and show, especially during the tour, but I'll hold them up and we'll go over them, and you can kind of picture where Orlando is today compared to these photos. Sound good? Everybody like this? All right. Now,
Don, I'm just going to say, when I first talked to you about this, you said that a lot of the things that you told on the tour were kind of impromptu by what people noticed and asked about, and you wondered
correct.
how we could. And I said, bring pictures, and we'll
Right.
jump off.
Yeah, I mean, it's different from being a physical where you can look at a stone or look at a family and tell their story than just going off the cuff. And I have more notes to go off the cuff, but we can go any direction. That's the beauty, is go in any direction. Now, this photo here, I'll put it real close. That is a very well-known location in Orlando today. That's Orange and Jackson. Now, if you're wondering what's there today, now at one point, this was a school. It was a high school. It became a city hall. It became the police department. The Utilities Commission was actually in this building. In 1906, it was torn down. They moved the high school. They built a new city hall. They built a new police department. And in the 70s, they made a park out of this, where this is. Anybody got a clue so far? I know it's written at the top, but has anybody got a clue what you would be looking at today where this is? How about if I told you the Sunbank downtown? This is the corner of Orange and Jackson, where the Sunbank building sits today. So another neat thing about that location is Orlando's first Piggly Wiggly was where the Sunbank is today. And I used to have some notes, which are somewhere around, on what the actual first day sales was. And it was literally like a dozen eggs for 12 cents was like, and now I can't give my eggs away during COVID. So, so we got these weird things or neat things in Orlando. Let me see if I can find us another quick picture. Oh, this is a building we all know. Okay. There's a building right over here that's still in Orlando today. Anybody recognize that building? What if I told you it's the Angeville Hotel? Now, the Angeville Hotel was the first $1 million hotel in Orlando, and it's still there. It's still called the Angeville, but it's no longer a hotel. Now it's office buildings, is what it is. And most people know it if you go downtown to Wall Street. It's where the Subway sub shop is in this building. So what's also unique about this building is there's a tunnel system that runs underneath this building and connects it to the Beecham Theater, which is across the street. So there's a tunnel system underneath Orange Avenue that connects this building with the Beecham. And prior, you probably don't see it over here, but over on this side of the photo would have been the San Juan Hotel. And it connected to San Juan also. So there's a lot of people don't realize that there's a tunnel system that runs underneath Orange Avenue. There's another set of tunnels down, close to downtown. Do you know where those are? No? Anybody from Orlando? No?
No.
That'll make it easy now. Actually, at OBT and Colonial, Orange Blossom Trail and Colonial, there's a tunnel system underneath that intersection. And where McNamara Pontiac used to be was a elementary school. So kids could go, that's how they got to school, was through that tunnel. And over the years, they've closed it down on that. But those are the two tunnels in downtown or in Orlando. And there's also two basements in Orlando that we know about. Both of them are bars. So let's see. Oh, here's Orange Avenue at Central.
Excuse me, what was the purpose for building the tunnels?
It depends. When it was downtown tunnels were to get the performers at the Beecham, because it was vaudeville and they had a lot of plays and stuff. So the performers could come back and forth from the hotel into the Beecham Theater. So there was that easy flow back and forth. So it made a neat little dichotomy of them trying to they didn't want the actors, since Orlando was so small, to have to go across the street or ship back and forth. So they built a tunnel system. And the best story I ever heard about the tunnel system was, there was a gentleman that worked for the gas company. And he said that one day he was down there fixing the gas lights in the tunnel. And this guy ran right past him, just flying past him in a tuxedo. And he said he sat there for a moment trying to figure out why this guy ran past him. Come to find out, there was a magic show going on in the Beecham. And it was the magician disappeared on stage, and he was running through the tunnel to come up in the Angeville and then enter through the back of the Beecham like he reappeared. So, the tunnel system's been used for years, but now it's blocked off. It's completely blocked off. The Angeville side, you can actually see where the bricking and the concrete are missed where the tunnel is. And on the Beecham side, it's still there, but it's sealed shut. There's a door there that's sealed shut, but they're still there. And the other tunnels was for the school kids, did not have to cross over OBT and 50. So that was the reason there. Because remember, you had, the Orlando Country Club and all that. And I believe the school was I think it was Grand Avenue, I believe. But it was there. But the tunnels are still, but they sealed off the tops, so you can't go through them anymore, which I don't think in today's time that we would want to go through tunnels on OBT anymore. That's OBT is not what it used to be. I don't think it ever was what it should be. So this is another photo of Orange and Central. Right here, I'll get it close. That's Orange and Central. Now, Orange is an avenue. And all avenues in Orlando run what direction? There's a system to it. All avenues run north and south in Orlando. So if someone told you to pick you up on an avenue, you would you would know that you would be going north and south. Streets are east and west in the city. They were done underneath Mayor Bob Carr. He was the one that decided that we're going to go to this uniform type of address system. But also, if you go downtown, you'll notice that if you go to Delaney is actually an avenue, is Delaney. But on Delaney Avenue is Delaney Street Baptist Church. So when they changed over, Delaney Street Baptist Church didn't want to change their name. So actually, you'll see that the Delaney Street Baptist Church is actually on Delaney Avenue. And so it's kind of a fun thing in Orlando that they didn't change at all. Now, here at Orange and Central, the one I just showed you, what made Central unique is Central is a boulevard. So we only had, at that time, one boulevard in Orlando. Do you know why it was allowed to become a boulevard when everything else had to go to avenue and streets? And it does run east and west. It's the 0 point of the city. So next time you go to Orange and Central, if you look, all the buildings will be one north, one south, one east, one west. So that's the starting point of the address system in Orlando, is Orange and Central. So they left Central as a boulevard so that you could kind of tell that difference there.
So in Winter Park, how come they named 1792 has so many names?
I don't, that's its own thing, because you're going between into cities and towns and so on. Same with Colonial. Colonial is also known as 50. Colonial is known some points as Cheney Highway. 50 is known at some points. So it changes as it goes. So it's hard to tell what. Look what I just got. She just paid a visit. Yeah. She's, and I guess, enamored with the computer right now. Would you like to go now? Okay. Yeah. Welcome
Don,
to
I have a question about the cemetery that I've heard you answer before, but I find it fascinating. How many cemeteries are in the city limits of Orlando?
Now there are technically two. Only one. The city of Orlando bought the cemetery in 1891, and they passed an ordinance, and it said that the only suitable place to get buried in Orlando was at Greenwood, was the only suitable place. So that really cut out all the other cemeteries in town. Greenwood was not the only one. There was one at on Church Street. There was one at Lake Highland. There was one Beasley's, which is close to Conway area. And so all over. But what happened is they had to close down because the city passed that ordinance. Now that ordinance is technically still on the books today, but there was an annexation. But as long as it stays in the hands of the same owners, they can still get buried. They can still do burials. But when the First Baptist Church of Orlando annexed all that property out off of John Young, they brought in down the road a small cemetery. And so technically there's two. Officially, according to the city, you should only get buried in one. And it's still chapter 16 today, the city code.
So is that a privately owned cemetery, or are these?
No, it's owned by the city. It's owned by the city. The cemetery was established in 1885 by private landowners. And what they did is the city started going through changes. There was a fire that year. I'm sorry, I'm catching chickens out of the corner of my eye walking. So when the city bought it, it had just burnt down. There was a fire that year. The cemetery burnt to the ground. Most of the headstones were wooden at that point. So the citizens of Orlando became very, distraught and upset that this was allowed to happen. And you can imagine today if a cemetery caught fire and burnt to the ground because it was not maintained. It was unmaintained. So, people would get upset about that. So when the city bought it, they passed the ordinance, and all of a sudden the city set themselves up in business and closed all the other cemeteries down in town. So it's a unique situation, and that's how Greenwood got the founding fathers of the city and how Greenwood got its status in the city, because for years and years, it was the only place you were allowed to be buried in Orlando. So if you go to Woodlawn, that's in Gotha. If you go to Chapel Hill, it's out. If you go to Highlands, it's in Apopka. All these cemeteries still today are outside of the city.
Who could
So
get,
the only,
who could get buried in them? Were there restrictions as to who could get buried in the city cemeteries?
correct, a resident of the city, you could get buried. And then they kind of laxed it for a little while. And now it's back to city residents. And if you're not a city resident, it's double fees if you're not. So that starts coming in when you start running into land issues. You know, they haven't figured out how to grow land. You know, so since they can't grow land, you only have so much you can use, and there's nowhere for Greenwood to expand. There's no areas for it to expand. So it's kind of set. And every year it gets, as they say, a little smaller, a little smaller, a little smaller. And it'll probably be sold out in, a few years.
I assume that the African-American cemeteries were separate.
No, actually not. Not in Orlando. The African-American or Black cemeteries in Orlando was still Greenwood. So it was a rare occasion in the South, even under Jim Crow laws, that the cemetery was actually integrated by fence line. It was still segregated under Jim Crow laws until the 1960s, where whites and blacks could not be, together. So there's 3 black sections in the cemetery, or segregated sections in the cemetery, and they're still there today. But of course, they're open to any burial. But most of them were sold out. You would sell out. There's pauper areas, there's family areas, and some of Orlando's large founders, black founders, Dr. Wells from the Wells-Built Museum of African American History is there. L. Claudia Allen, we have a senior center named after her. We have the Bray Boys. We have J.A. Collier, the first black businessman to venture into the white business district. So he was the first, business that moved out of what we now would refer to as the Paramore area into the white district. And he was a tailor. So you have him, who was a pioneer. July Perry, which you're going to hear a lot about, or you're reading about him in the paper now. And I'm doing a thing on him on 104.1 on the radio on Monday. It's the 100th anniversary of his death, and he was lynched, and all he wanted to do was vote. And this is the 100th anniversary of his lynching. And it's turned into this very large thing, which is very needed, only because for almost, I would say, 97 years, Ocoee never, ever would admit that this massacre and this riot happened in 1920. And 1920 was a major year for voting rights because it was the first year that women could vote and the first year African Americans could vote. So it was a huge vote that year. And so, July Perry was turned away at the polling place in Ocoee and was hung in Orlando. And so you're going to see a lot on the news coming up next week, and a lot of things happening, because Ocoee has finally recognized a couple years ago that, yes, it did happen. There is the lynching museum in Alabama, has acknowledged everything that's happened in Ocoee. And so you're going to see this whole thing starting on Monday of next week, but the paper's been running it probably for the last week or week and a half. They've done stories on the Ocoee massacre. And that's something you can look up too.
It wasn't just July Perry that was killed. It was the whole black population was
Correct.
run out.
Correct. Yeah, every black family, every black business, every black grove, every black church, anything that had to do with anybody of a person of color was burned out of Ocoee 100 years ago on Monday, November 2nd. The lynching happened the day later on November the 3rd. So that's going to fall exactly on our election day this year. It's going to fall. So there was a lot, but July Perry is getting I hate to say the notoriety only because he was a wealthy landowner in Ocoee. He controlled all of the labor in Ocoee. So imagine here you are, this white landowner, and you have orange groves, because Ocoee and Winter Garden, Claremont, everything else was very agricultural. Very agricultural. It was orange, built on orange groves. And you, as a white landowner, had to go through July Perry and Mose Norman just to get your groves picked. And so if you didn't play fair, then July and Mose could send the crew to somebody else's grove. They could send it. So they controlled all of the labor, and how if you as a white person, they could control your income if you didn't play by their rules. And so that made July Perry a wealthy man on one end and hated on the other. So July Perry became the face of this riot only because the riot started with him wanting to vote, the blacks or the whites suppressing his right to vote, and Sam Salisbury, who was the chief of police in Orlando until August of 1920, served the arrest warrant on July Perry that night and Mose Norman and was shot. And so that's what started the massacre. And a lot of the families in Ocoee were never, I've heard numbers from 4 to 200 that night. There's no exact count on what happened in Ocoee that evening because everybody looked the other way for 95 years. They looked the other way. I've been telling July Perry's story since I started my first tour. He's my first story on every tour I've ever done. He's my first story. I mean, this man, all he wanted to do was to his legal right to put his vote on a piece of paper. That's all he wanted to do. And he was murdered that night for it. And he was hung just for wanting his legal right to vote. I know. Let's see. Let's go to a happier thing. Let's see.
Oh, but before you leave the cemetery, Tom, there's a cemetery on Bruton Boulevard, a black cemetery. Do you know the history of that one?
Yeah, that's the one that was annexed in, right there. That belongs. It's a very old black cemetery, and they annexed that cemetery in. It's right beside a church. If you go down Bruton near L.B. McLeod, when the First Baptist Church of Orlando wanted to move out to L.B. McLeod, originally, of course, they were at church in Roseland downtown. The city wanted that tax money, is what they wanted. Now it's a church; they don't pay income tax. They pay a whole bunch of building taxes. They pay a whole bunch there. Plus, they made a very good deal that if you notice that if any high profile funerals happen in town, any police fire, they always happen there at that sanctuary. It's one of the largest in town, everything. So when they annexed that in, the small African-American cemetery was annexed with it. And so, it's a good cemetery. The city, they tried to give it to the city, but it's got a bunch of baggage that comes with that cemetery on that one. Any other questions we could talk about Greenwood all night on that. Just looking through here. This building's still here. It looks the same still. This is built in 1913. It was the old Ivies. And it's still there at 1 South Orange. So since it's at 1 South Orange, what intersection is it at? Come on. Orange and Central.
Yeah.
It'd be Central. Yeah, because Central's the dividing point. So whenever they talk about Central, they got a bunch of pictures of that one. Here is old Yao Drew Company, and both Yao and Drew families are buried at Greenwood, but you can actually see the Angeville in this one too. It's right over here on that. So a lot of this, if you stand back and you look at some of these photos, you can actually see the buildings that are still there. Orlando's done its share of tearing everything down. This was probably taken in the 80s. I'm gonna see. Yeah, it was taken in the 80s. If you notice the C&A building in the back, it's still in Orlando. It's changed, but the C&A building, that's where the Citrus Club is in this building at the top, way up here, is there. So, anybody been to the Citrus Club? It's a fun place to go. That's a fun place to go. Oh, that's all the same building here. Let's see. The Ivies. Any questions while I'm looking through?
Well, while you're looking through, Don, tell us what it was like when you started reading the old records.
Oh, that's what I love to do. Actually, that was my love. When I started with the city, I just wanted, a job. I really was your, average teenager, and found this love in the records department. Now, this is the early 1980s, or the mid to end 1980s, and computers weren't anything. We didn't have computers. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have any of that. So I got a job with the records department, and we started going through, and that's when microfilm was coming around, becoming popular. So we microfilmed everything that we could find, regular files, everything. But as time started progressing, we started to become digital. Computers started coming in. City Hall, I got my first desktop computer, I believe in 1991 is when, because we moved from the old City Hall, which you can see at the beginning of Lethal Weapon 3. So if you ever wondered what the old City Hall looked like, it was at the very beginning of Lethal Weapon 3, and it's blown up. They blew it up, and you can see Mayor Frederick. He plays, I think, someone from the bomb squad in it. But it's a really fun look at Orlando, and you can see the new City Hall behind it, and it's a Coca-Cola plant, is what it is. It's so when you see the beginning, and that's all you got to see of the movie is the first 10 minutes, and you can turn it off. But it's really cool because we as Orlando would go out every night and watch them re-blow up City Hall, because they only imploded it one time, of course, but every night they would shoot off these huge pyrotechnics and blow the windows out and do all that. And then in the morning, they clean all the soot off the front of the building. They replace the windows with other fake looking windows. And then the next night they do it all over again. They did it for almost a week. They would blow up the windows out of City Hall. And then on the final night, they imploded it. So it was really cool to watch the building literally collapse upon itself. Now, what a lot of people don't tell you is the old City Hall and the new City Hall were literally 10 feet apart at one point. At one point of that, it was 10 feet. No one thought that an implosion would cause enough pressure that they shouldn't have protected the new City Hall. It took out all the first floor glass on the new City Hall. So here we are in this new building, and they blow out the doors and they blow out the glass from the compression of the building dropping. So it was really fun to watch. And that was one of the cool things about Orlando is the history of that building. And so when we moved into the new City Hall in 91, we got laptop computers or desktop computers. So as computers started coming into age, the microfilm wasn't searchable. Microfilm is not, it was keyed and tagged, and you had to look. Anybody familiar with microfilm? Anybody ever have to use it in school? Yeah, it's fun, isn't it? So we started going to digital. So a lot of the microfilm we could convert, but the older stuff, the handwritten documents, you can't convert. Computers cannot read handwritten documents. They can only read typeset documents. So Orlando didn't get its first typewriter until 1914, is when the city started using typewriters. So from 1875 to 1914, all of the minutes were handwritten. So the entire building of our city was handwritten in quill pen. So I got the beauty of literally reading every single word from 1875 up until 1914 and transcribed it into tape recorders. We sent the tapes to a court reporter. The court reporter would transcribe them on the computer and basically take dictation. And then we could actually put it in the system, go in, digitize it, became searchable, do all that. So it just became this beautiful thing that you could sit and learn about the city. And then around 2004, maybe it was right before the hurricane, so 2003, they wanted Greenwood to become a place of history, not a park or not somewhere that people, not green space. So it became really neat when they put it in with archives. So they took the cemetery and put it in with archives. So it became a place of history at that point. And with the flow of it was all the years that I had since the early 80s, that these stories that I talked in the tape recorders and the stories that we filmed their documents and we converted the documents, these people became like real life to me, because all of a sudden you had a headstone that you had a story with, or you had something that you had the story. And it made it very unique that when you walk up to Boone and you go, oh, there's Boone. Okay, there's Boone Street. How did it become Boone Street? And then it's, wait a minute, I have receipts from Boone Hardware. Oh, it's the same person. He was a city clerk. You look at the articles of incorporation for the city. He was on the articles of incorporation for the city. So it starts putting puzzle pieces together as you went through. And Orlando has been transient since day one. So a lot of people have no clue about the city's history. They don't, you go to Lake Eola, but what is Lake Eola? How did it become Lake Eola? How did the city get it? Where did its name come from? What's the neat things around the lake? And it's so unique to be able to go back and find the history of it and put it in stories and put it together. And that's what luckily in my career I got to do. Now, of course, everything goes in and it's pretty much already digital. And, so you don't have that, archives like you had before, because everything now is computer based, and you didn't have that transition between handwritten to being able to read it into a tape recorder, to be able to see it, to be able to put it into a computer, to be able to search it. And so now, I can take a photograph on my phone of a letter and it converts it automatically searchable. So, we've come a long way in a short bit of time. Any questions about Lake Eola? Is one of my favorite.
I have a question. Just, a lot of talk about the voting rolls are not very accurate and stuff. And I remember when my parents died, I didn't think to take them off the voting rolls, where they lived. What happens now when people do die in Orange County? Is there a process for removing them from the voting rolls?
Yeah, but that's handled through the county, not the city. But yeah, there's a process. When you file your death certificate, there's checks and balances that go. Your social, and I always tell people too, the minute you die, your social security number becomes public. The minute you die. So I always say protect certain things that you can now, because it's very easy for identity theft on a death, because all of a sudden people are filing, especially obituaries and everything else. I can find out so much about a person, your date of birth, your name, who your sisters are, your family. And now all of a sudden I've got access to your social security. That's public until the state recognizes your death. You got your death certificate, you've got all that. And that's when the state recognizes it and they flag your social as being dead. But it's that time in between that people can be up to no good. So I always say, get that death certificate filed, get as many copies as you can. Some places take Xerox copies, some need originals, but send them to your mortgage company, send them to, have your family, send them to anywhere. Because even something as a like for example, your cell phone. Now it's not as normal anymore to have these long-term contracts. But imagine calling the phone company and trying to cancel your phone and them going, no, they're under contract. We can't cancel your phone. Greenwood used to get tons of bills for people because they get tired, the families will get tired of telling the bill companies that, you know, their aunt died. So please stop calling. And they keep calling and calling and calling. So finally they say, look, their new address is 1603 Greenwood Street. Go ahead and send the bill there. And maybe they'll take care of it. Maybe they won't. And then when we get the bill, sometimes I, you know, have a little fun with it and take a photo at their gravesite. And, you know, we tag the bill company on social media. But, you know, but now it's becoming a little easier. But I always say have your family, tell your family to get, you know, what they need a death certificate for and what they need, because that stops that, you know, any type of fraud. If you can get a death certificate to your mortgage company or to any of that within a few days, then it stops anybody on that register. And a lot of people just figure, you know, it'll, you know, no big deal. You know, they passed away, but you got to think, you got cars, you got mortgages. I mean, imagine if someone comes in and files a quick claim deed on your property. It happens now, you know.
I have a question too, is about, and in Kansas where my parents died, the funeral home has to send in the obituary. Is that so in Florida too? You can't send it in yourself.
The obituary or the death certificate?
No, well, like the obituary to the newspaper. It has to come officially.
Oh no, you can send your own in.
No, in Kansas.
No, you can send your own. Yeah,
Kansas,
you can put in your own. Yeah, you know, I've seen some great ones where families send in on their own. But see, now obituaries aren't free anymore. So, you know, you don't even have to have an obituary. I always recommend at least putting where you're going to be buried in your obituary. At least put where you're going to be buried. You can have it as simple as John Smith, Greenwood Cemetery. Only because you're going to have grandchildren or great-grandchildren or great-great-grandchildren that one day they're going to want to know your story. And with computers today, they can search your name and the year you died. And if they can get at least the information on the cemetery, it helps a lot because it gives that closure. We had people that would call the cemetery looking for their grandparents or great-grandparents, having no clue whether they were at Greenwood, at Woodlawn, or because now the funeral homes or families, since they get charged by word, they leave out what cemetery they're going to because it might cost them an extra $20 to put it in, so they leave it out. So I say put that in because that's what you're going to need for genealogy down the road, is that cemetery spot. And you can learn a lot just from what's going on in a cemetery. I mean, you can find out from the cemetery, death dates and things like that you can actually look up in a newspaper, that you can Google. Because a lot of people, when you go 2 or 3 generations, they haven't been told the story. They haven't been told your story. And so it starts to fade, is your story. You know, a lot of people don't know a lot about their great-grandparents. A lot of people don't know about their great-great-grandparents. And so to continue at least to know where they are, that part of town, it's amazing to do. I always say, just put the cemetery's name in there, always have it put in. So down the road, they can Google you and figure it out. I got a chicken walking under my feet. But now at Lake Eola, we'll jump there real quick. Anybody know where the Cherry Plaza Hotel is? Now they know it, call it the Plaza. Do you know where World of Beer is downtown? Right by Lake Eola? That used to be the Cherry Plaza. You know, that's where Disney World was announced, was right there at that hotel. So Walt Disney came in, he was in the Egyptian room. They announced the opening of Disney World right in downtown Orlando. Today you can go there and have a beer. It's a World of Beer. For years when I was a kid, it was Lee's Lakeside. You could go there on Sunday and have all that. But that building is still there. Right near that is a hotel, now it's condos, that was actually owned at one time by Leona Helmsley. You remember Queen Amene? She owned all the hotels in New York, and they say she treated her staff so bad. She owned a hotel here in Orlando, and it's right across from the band shell. Now it's condos. You can usually see the pool. But Gypsy Rose Lee was arrested in Orlando, and she was staying at that hotel. Does that name ring a bell? What happens if I tell you the play Gypsy, which was about the first stripper? Because when you had burlesque and all, she was the first one that was, that they say coined that style of stripping, and they made the play after a gypsy. She was arrested here in Orlando for indecent exposure at that point. So, we have all this fun little history in Orlando. The Sperry Fountain that's in downtown Orlando. That's a replica. It's not even the real fountain. The real fountain's at Greenwood. So, they have a replica fountain that actually claims it's the fountain at Lake Eola. So, there's fun little facts. The UFO fountain in the middle of it, it's got a name. The Linton E. Allen Memorial Fountain is the name of that fountain. How many people just say, man, it's just that UFO fountain. It's that ugly fountain in the middle, but it's got a name. And that name attaches it to Linton E. Allen. Linton E. Allen was president of one of the banks in town. He wanted something in Orlando that would carry on and have an icon. So then you start taking those pieces, and I've got a really good friend, Norman Bassett. His grandfather designed that fountain in his garage because his next door neighbor was Linton E. Allen. And Nathan has a company in town, and he fixes irrigation systems. He still has the original model that his grandfather built of that fountain. So, it's just putting these pieces together to make Orlando fun.
Don, you seem like you're the genealogist really for the city of Orlando. And every time I've met a genealogist, they found something out somewhere along the line that really excited them, that they looked for, didn't find. Did you find anything like that?
Oh, we found a lot as we went through. And a lot of it I've tried to come out. And I'm just going to look through some of my notes here and see which. One of the neatest things is if you go downtown, if you go downtown, I've got a chicken behind the computer there. So if you see a little head reach over, it's just a chicken. One of the funniest stories is in 1912, the Wild Bill Hickok show was in town. Wild Bill, with most of them, did vaudeville, and they go town to town, and they'd have their different shows and everything. So Wild Bill Hickok was having a vaudeville show in Orlando, and his prized showpiece was Barney the Buffalo. Was his showpiece that he traveled the country with Barney the Buffalo. And if you remember back in the day, you would have tours done by, Billy the Kid, or not Billy the Kid, I take that, but Wild Bill Hickok, and so on. They would go around after their claim to fame. They'd write stories about them, and then they'd make their money in vaudeville going around to these shows. But Wild Bill had a show, and like I said, his star was Barney. Barney got what they call heat fever in the brain and started running down Orange Avenue. So Barney escaped, ran down Orange Avenue, and he was shot and killed right there at Orange and Church Street. He was shot and killed right there. So it became this fun thing that when Rosie's O'Grady's, y'all remember Rosie O'Grady's? Ever go there? One of the places at Rosie O'Grady's was the Buffalo Trading Post, was one of the outbuildings at Rosie's. And they had a stuffed buffalo in there. So we always tried to figure out the connection. And Bob Snow wouldn't come up with, with the answer to that. But we have these little clues in Orlando that you just put together sometimes by accident. We have Gertrude's Walk downtown. Gertrude's Suite, it's a walkway between Church Street and Pine Street. And it's just a 4-person wide sidewalk. And it's called Gertrude's Walk. And there's a sign there. There's a sign there that's got a woman holding a parasol, and she's walking down, street. So you see this thing, you're like, okay. Come to find out, Gertrude Sweet was known as Orlando's most beautiful woman. She was the most beautiful woman. She was 5'10" back in the day. And she would have, they say, flowing red hair, blue eyes, but she was Mayor Sweet's sister. So it became this funny thing that how did she get this walk? How did she? And a lot of people walk up and down this sidewalk every single day and look at that sign and don't make the connection. And I think I even have a photo of Gertrude somewhere in here. I thought I saw it. But I mean, it's these little stories that you put together, and sometimes you would just have this aha moment is what you would have, where you would go, wait a minute, you know, that now it makes sense, or now we've completed the circle. And a lot of times it's people coming up after a tour and going, let me tell you the real story. You know, let me tell you what really happened. And that gave you a little more to put the pieces together, because there's not a lot of written history on Orlando. There's you know, Eve Bacon had a series of books, and those series of books are very good, but she took them out of the minutes. And so a lot of them are not 100% true. So it'll get you up to bat, but a lot of times it won't get you on base when it comes to a lot of her writing, because she was going from a very one-dimensional view of Orlando, going from the minutes and then creating these stories. There was W.F. Blackman's History of Orange County, which is a great book if you're rich and white. I mean, it's a great book because everybody that got in his book, now he was president of Rollins College in the 1920s. So he was very well-to-do, very well-known. And he wrote this book, History of Orange County. But the book was published in 1924. There's no mention of the Ocoee massacre, which we're getting ready to hit on the 100th year of. This would be 4 years after this massacre. There is a whole chapter on West Orange County, not one mention of it. The only people that are talked about in the book are the Hands, Carrie Hand and so on, the Boones, the mayors of Orlando. Anybody with wealth was put in his book, and that's what scholars have relied on for years is about this book, but it's very one-sided. It's a one-sided piece of history. There was a couple books that were written, Mahlon Gore, who was mayor of Orlando, and Gore Street's named in his honor. His nephew wrote a book at one point, and it's a great read for Orlando, but it has no index to it. So it's real hard to look something up and try to go back, because instead of having something that you can go back and say, okay, Sperry Fountain, Lake Eola, any of that, it's not. It's written just like a novel. There's no index at the end. So it makes it really hard to gather information from. So, you know, Orlando is really weird on its written history, and a lot of it has to do with how transient it is. And there's very few people that were born here. You know, you can take a poll right now out of the people that are here. How many were born here? See, it's transient. So a lot of people, they didn't take their stories with, you know, they lived it, they were gone in a few years, or they moved into the city and it was always there. So they just assumed it was there because it was there. But we have some great history here. I mean, Francis Epps, the First Methodist Church of downtown was here. Hold on, I'll show you. At Chicken's Back. But so Francis Epps is Thomas Jefferson's grandson, who ended up settling here in Orlando. He was former mayor of Tallahassee. He was born at Monticello. He lived there with his grandfather until his grandfather died. As most people know about history, the Jefferson property or Monticello was in ruins, but you know, at the end, and it's just been restored over the last couple of decades. But Thomas Jefferson pretty much died broke. The only thing that he really had to inherit was the poplar forest, which you can still visit. That was the only thing that he had. That Francis Epps got that as part of his inheritance. So here he is in Orlando. He finds or founded a church here. He lived on Osceola Avenue, right downtown here, right outside of downtown, Delaney area. And here we are with the third or the grandson of the third president of the United States here in Orlando. So, and a lot of people keep walking by that and they don't think. And then when you go back and you look at Epps, he's the founder of Florida State University, which is originally Florida State School for Women. Before that, it was the Western Theological School. So, here's the founder of Florida State University buried at Greenwood, and no one cares. It's nothing that people talk about. And especially, it's neat. You've got, in the 1970s, the Richard Nixon was out at FTU, which is now UCF. And he gave a beautiful keynote speech on what's great with America was his speech at FTU. 6 months later is when everything was happening with Watergate and all that. Do you know that his most famous speech, "I'm Not a Crook," was done here in Orlando? Not only in Orlando, it was done at the Contemporary Hotel in the Hall of the Americas. So, here we got these famous things that are happening that, it's just not part of history. I mean, everybody knows Richard Nixon, the "I'm Not a Crook" speech. That you can still go to the Hall of the Americas, or the Room of the Americas at the Contemporary today. It's still there. And he gave that speech there. We've got the Beatles broke up at the Contemporary Hotel. Or, I'm sorry, the Polynesian. That's where John Lennon was staying when he sent the letter out, the infamous letter to break up the Beatles, was at the Polynesian. So we have this fun little history, these facts that just jump around that no one really, cares about or jumps about. A few other things. How long are y'all usually on here? Oh, that was a chicken jumping.
We're usually on about an hour, Don.
Then I'll make it quick because we're almost to that point.
Well, don't let me off.
Buddy Ebsen is from Orlando. Most people know him as Jed Clampett, or do you know he graduated from Orlando High School? And we call him Buddy. We call him Buddy Ebsen. Our mayor is Buddy Dyer. Does anybody know what Buddy's real name is? It's John Dyer. What about Buddy Ebsen? Buddy's not his real name. Ludorf Ebsen. Now you know why he goes by Buddy. But the he graduated from Orlando High School. His parents had a dance studio here. The building is still in Orlando. His very first big role was Wizard of Oz. He was the Tin Man in the Wizard of Oz until they painted him and he almost died. And so he couldn't perform in it. And he went on for years, and everybody knows him now as Jed Clampett, or what, Marcus Welby, or Barney, was it Barney Willow? I don't know. I'm trying to think. Do you know DDT was created here in Orlando? The chemical DDT, the most highly, probably caustic chemical to cause all the cancer, was actually at Livingston and Paramore. Right there is where DDT was actually invented, is in Orlando. And let's see, the first interracial Little League baseball game was played here in Orlando in 1955. So the first time Little League players ever played against races was here in Orlando, right at Lake Lorna Dune Park, over there by where the Citrus Bowl is, or Tangerine Bowl is today, was there. Trying to think.
There was a video of that. They made a movie of that baseball game and the kids who were involved with that. I saw it.
Yes, they did. And, a lot of people don't realize that the history that's right here. So we have, I'm trying to think of other things that we did. The Martin Marietta plant. If you go up near the Mall Millennia, there's Radaball Street. It's a little street near the Mall Millennia. Cushman Radaball at one point was the richest man in Central Florida because he bought all that property, which we now know as International Drive, Martin Marietta, all the way through. He bought that for almost 30 cents an acre. And it was 2,600 acres of land. and he sold it, I believe, at $1,900 an acre for somebody that bought literally for 35 cents an acre. So, he became overnight one of the richest men in Orlando at that point. So, we have all this. We have a story of Hiram Calder, which is one of my favorite stories, where, especially with voting now, Hiram was here in Orlando, and he voted in elections all the way through. I'm trying to think, Hiram Calder died around 1914. So he was involved in elections prior to that, up until, the 1900s, late 1800s. Hiram raised his daughter alone because his wife had died. When he died, come to find out, Hiram was a woman.
What?
Hiram was a woman. So the undertaker found out that Hiram was not a guy. He didn't have the right parts. So come to find out, Hiram had a child out of wedlock. And in the 1800s, of course, it was, so he took the identity, or she took the identity of a man so that she could raise and she wouldn't be shunned. So when people start talking about voting, she was actually the first woman to ever vote in any election because they thought he was a man or she was a man. Now, she never claimed anywhere else. It's not like today she just acted as a man and lived as a man, so she wouldn't, be shamed for having a child out of wedlock back then. So with all the voting going on now, it's kind of fun that you got this story and you're like, it's there. You've got, McCoy Airport, MCO. When you fly into Orlando, it's MCO. And a lot of families don't realize that used to be, Orlando Air Base or McCoy Air Base. So that's where you get the MCO is from McCoy. And, so you have McCoy who crashed his bomber right there at what we now know is Trotters Park or Ben White Raceway. He crashed a bomber there. And so all this fun little history that we see around town all links up in some way or another. That makes sense.
It makes sense, and I hate to break the flow because this has been fun, but you told me that you would tell us a ghost story.
Let's see, the one story that I have, and this actually happened at the cemetery. Actually, there's two that I could go into, and I'll make them quick. First one we were having, it was a blue moon, similar to this weekend. This weekend is a blue moon. For those aren't familiar, a blue moon they call it rare because it's two full moons within the same month. So we had a full moon at the beginning of this month, and now we have one officially tomorrow. It's a full moon. So it's a blue moon. So we were having a blue moon, and we had a bunch of mediums at the cemetery that night just to see. And people came from all around, and it was just a medium night. And then I purposely didn't say a word or didn't say anything because I wanted to see if it was hokey or anything that went on. And of course I got there's at least half females here and half males. And I'm like, okay, that's a given. But this one lady walked by this one grave and she just goes like this. She goes, wow, I got sharp pain right here. And I'm like, oh, okay. She walked away. Didn't think anything of it. She came back through probably about 20 minutes later, and I was standing up on the hill. She walked past that spot again, and she did this again. She goes, wow, that's crazy. She just kept walking and thinking anything of it. So about a month later, I was talking to Jim Fleming, and I said, you know what? We had this medium up by your grandfather's grave, and she kept grabbing the right side of her head like that. And he got this little grin on his face. And he says, yeah, Grandpa died from a gunshot wound to the right of his head. And I went, what? He goes, yeah. There's nowhere on Google that you can find that. Nowhere. I have Googled that. There was no way she could have known that. It's not on any death certificates, not on any death records, not on anything. Now, which made it weirder is that he was paralyzed in his right arm. So it was listed as an accidental death by his own hand. So it even got a little more confusing, because if you're paralyzed in your hand, in your arm, how can you take a shot into your right side of the head? And it'd be called self-inflicted accidental. Come to find out, he had a loaded pistol in his belt, and he was coming down the stairs and he tripped. And when he tripped, the gun went off when he hit, and it shot him in the right side of the head. There's nowhere, we have no records of that at the cemetery. We have no records anywhere. For her to be able to pull that out was just amazing. And that was really the only real thing that night. But one of the best stories we have is we had a caretaker, and it was his first week on the job. And he wasn't really good at reading maps. And if you work in a cemetery, maps are your life, because you've got survey markers and stuff on the ground that you got to find. You got to know where you're at, because you don't want to bury someone where they don't need to be, because, you know, that's embarrassing. And, you know, that's the last phone call you want to make to a family. So he was standing out there, and I was kind of standing back trying to get a vibe of what he was doing, or how he could do, or what he was doing. And I kind of chuckled that the map was upside down. And I'm like, I'm not going to say a word. I'm just going to see if he can figure it out. So I'm sitting back, and he starts going towards where he's supposed to go. And I'm sitting there confused, because this map that he's got is probably, 18 by 24. It's huge. I can see everything where I'm at. And he went right to where he was supposed to go. And I'm thinking, okay, he's got to be dyslexic at this point, because he's not seeing what I'm seeing. And then he tells me that he's really weird because he felt tugged in that thing. So he said he literally was looking at the map and felt someone tugging at his elbow and pulled him over to that. And it was the broad daylight, one of the weirdest things. And I stood there and watched the whole thing. And I'm going to tell you, there was no way he could have gotten to that spot the way he was holding that map. But he just said it was really weird that I felt getting tugged. And I'm like, okay, that's it. And then, of course, Bantrice Russell is buried at Greenwood, the Russell Home for Atypical Children. She's at Greenwood. And whenever the special kids would come out and clean the grave, they'd always point and tell us where she was. And they would all be on the same little. And so it was really amazing that, these special needs children, that they would go, oh, there's grandma. And it was an amazing thing that they could describe and do everything. So there's something on the other side. I just can't see it. I can't feel it. I can't see it. But it's amazing some of what people have told me that we can verify, but there's nowhere else that you could, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. And I really like that it's a friendly atmosphere.
Of course. I mean,
that help. I love that.
Cemeteries, I was talking to someone the other day, and they were talking about how they don't like cemeteries because they're scary and they're icky and they're everything about it. And, my comment to them was, a cemetery is nothing but love. It's romanticize a cemetery. And they looked at me like I had, two heads. And I'm like, well, at home, if you do something for your spouse, or you do something for your kids, or you do something for your grandkids, there's usually something you expect in return. If I go out grocery shopping, then I expect you to do this. Or if I clean the room, then I expect you to do this. But at a cemetery, you get nothing in return. There's absolutely nothing you get back. So you spend your time, and you might go on a birthday or go on a holiday, go pick up flowers, make sure that something's taken care of, but you get absolutely nothing in return. So you do it out of an act of love. There's nothing in that's in you that's saying, you know what, if I go out to the cemetery and take my time and rake the leaves off the grave or put some fresh flowers up, there's absolutely nothing that you will get in return except the love you have from that person. And so you romanticize it that way, and all of a sudden the cemetery should have a whole new meaning on that.
I love that, Don, and I think that's a good place to end the evening. What do you think?
Well, y'all, that's fine with me. Y'all have a wonderful evening and enjoy your wine and cheese, as they say.
Thank you
I'm
so
gonna
much for
Thank
joining
you.
us.
No problem. Thanks for coming out, and come back and visit the farm another time.